Welcome back to the Housing Committee and welcome to our second panel of guests. We have Dr. Tom Moore, Senior Lecturer in Planning at the University of Liverpool, Tom Copley, who's Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development, Levent Kerimol, Director of Community-Led Housing London, Paul Nicoll, Head of Societal Lending at Triodos Bank, and Natalie Daniels, Assistant Director of Housing at the Greater London Authority, who is joining us online. So, let's go straight to our first question in this set, and Assembly Member Leonie Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with, we've got a plethora of Toms today. We had one on the first panel as well. I'd like to start with Dr. Tom Moore. I don't know whether you were able to hear our first discussion. Yeah. So reflecting on the discussion with the previous panel, to what extent can community-led housing accommodate specialist housing needs and communities who face disadvantage in the mainstream housing sector? And full disclosure, I used to work for a cooperative that used to house people in therapeutic communities and set many of them up on a cooperative basis, each property, but the whole organisation was a workers' cooperative and a housing cooperative overall. So back in the day, it has worked very well. What are your reflections on how well it could work now?
My reflection, and based on the previous conversation, is absolutely it can help to meet those specialist needs, if we want to call them that. How we define what specialist needs are, there's various definitions, but I think some of the research and studies that I've been involved with at the university, I'll give you two examples, I suppose. I evaluated a large-scale investment by Power to Change, charitable trust, into the community-led housing sector, looking at the impact. They dispersed grants to community-led housing projects and community-led housing hubs in 5 urban areas. And our evaluation found that 2/3 of the organisations that applied for and received grants through that programme were located in the 30% most deprived areas in the country. So I think in the first panel we spoke a little bit about whether community-led housing is orientated towards there's a debate about terminology, but upper middle income, middle class, whatever you want to say. There is that stereotype in perception. I do think there's work to be done to tackle that. But I do think if you look at some of the evidence, it actually shows that community-led housing is meeting more acute housing needs. And secondly, and I guess just building on the contribution by our colleague from Gida Housing Cooperative, I'm in the process of completing a research project on community-led housing for black and minority ethnic communities in England, working in collaboration with colleagues from Leeds Community Homes and Pathway Housing Solutions. And we found there that, there are a really fantastic range of community-led housing projects taken up by black and minority ethnic communities, both historic and contemporary, including some or many in London. But there are also a range of barriers, and we talked about the kind of awareness and issues to do with word of mouth, as we put it in the first session. They're really significant barriers, as well as access to funding as well. But I think the evidence shows that, yes, absolutely, it can contribute to meeting those needs.
Thank you. I think that's very interesting, and certainly I think there are a range of needs, as you've alluded to as well, that could be better met perhaps in that way. And certainly when I was involved in this, we had and I know there used to be a number of therapeutic communities across the country for adults with learning disabilities who would then live in that kind of environment to help them achieve absolutely the best in their lives, and make sure they got to work and had jobs and things like that as well, to really allow them to have a very full life. Can I come to Levent? Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. I feel the same. I'm not too bothered about how my name is pronounced. It gets scrambled occasionally. I'm sure yours does too. Hope I haven't scrambled it too badly. To what extent have community land trusts been able to deliver in the current economic environment, with the increased costs, as we were discussing earlier on, land, construction, building materials, and obviously workforce challenges as well?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of development, it is very difficult, not just for community land trusts, I think for everyone.
No.
Big housing associations, even the big developers, I think, are kind of really putting pauses on. Reasons are fairly obvious. The big ones, construction costs.
Redrow, who were hardly small, just suddenly announced that they were completely pulling out of London.
Yeah, and the other one is councils. I've seen a couple of councils kind of scale back or shut down some of their... So it's hard for everyone.
Yeah.
I think it's probably extra hard for community-led housing organisations because they tend to be smaller. They don't have the assets and the track record. Their ability to borrow is usually a small number of banks. That we've seen some of their, not just their interest rates, but their terms change as well, to become kind of much more difficult to make progress. So it is really hard to develop at the moment. But perhaps we need to be thinking about, is development the right thing for small organisations to even be doing, given it's so hard for everyone?
Okay, well, so just being management organisations then, if they're not doing development?
Well, acquisition could be a lot less risky as well. Usually the interest rates, we'll ask our lender friend here, can be a bit safer because you're buying an existing asset, and the length of time is probably shorter if it's something you can move into as well. Okay, so acquisition on the market rather than building from scratch. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Hi, thanks, Chair. My question is just about the benefits of community housing and how they provide these over different models, and if you could just talk about how you see, what you see those benefits are, and how could the mayor and other large developers do more to support the development of CLTs? I don't mind who starts, maybe Paul. Thanks. So it's just about benefits of community housing providing as a model around kind of delivery on small sites, not-for-profit, tenant democracy, those things, and then how can that be supported more by the mayor and large developers?
Absolutely. We think that's really important, that sort of ownership by the community. And the challenges are with that, though, as has been alluded to, it is very difficult at the moment to get things going and to maintain them. And many of these people are obviously volunteers and have other jobs and responsibilities. And when things get tough, it is very difficult. So I think from our point of view, although there's risks in development and pricing and costs, there's also sort of governance risks and people risks. And some of these projects can take years and years and years to come to fruition, before you've got a business plan perhaps, or any sort of plan that is viable. So I think there's a lot of support that can be given in those sort of early embryonic stages to identify the risks and try and mitigate those risks, and make sure there isn't too much reliance on particular individuals within a group, and that it's sort of well balanced. And that can be quite difficult to do in smaller groups. The larger the group gets and the more it pulls in expertise, the more credible a plan it can produce, and the more it can sort of anticipate sort of bumps and problems, really. Because from a lender's point of view, although these are very much community projects, we have to look at it as a sort of business proposition in a way, particularly where there's development, because they are sort of business risks at that stage, and then the risk profile changes. But I think consistent advice and support, there's many organisations that do that, but I think that there's a difference between the support that you need to get to the point of developing a plan, but then executing that plan, whether you're buying existing stock or whether you're developing, executing that plan, and the expertise and time and talent and support needed to do that is quite significant. So signposting people and kind of, without knocking the wind out of people's sails, saying, look, all these type of things can go wrong. You need to anticipate this. You need to have a plan for that. You need to know what you're going to do if this happens, so that everybody goes in with their eyes open. Because you do see, it's been difficult in the last few years with the pandemic, with costs and with loads of other factors as well. So those that survived through that period are probably pretty robust. But we've seen a lot of projects where people have just decided we can't do that now. It's too tricky. So the more external support and professional support, the better.
Thanks. And just to add in before the question goes down the line, just how, if you could add in how why the mayor should support this form of housing model over other types like housing associations or council delivery. If you can just add that in to your reflections, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
You asked about the benefits, and I think what is unique about community-led housing compared to pretty much all other models is the sense of control that residents and wider communities have over their own homes. I think it's not so. I mean, previously you were talking about the affordability. It can kind of be any tenure, really. It's about control. It's about empowerment, and that gives a sense of belonging to residents. And I think, it might address some specialist needs, but it doesn't. I think those needs or aspirations even are common to everyone, and that's whether you're in council housing association housing, the sense of agency over the landlord, in the private rented sector especially, and even in market housing. Perhaps you don't have it in so much the owner-occupier, but if you're looking at new builds, the sense of control over what is built and the form that takes, I think those are unique to community-led housing. And I think if we focus on what is special, and maybe we can think about how we, all the rest of it, whether it's, are they developing on small sites? I don't think that's unique to community-led housing. I don't think any particular tenure model is unique to community-led housing. It's that governance and democratic control that residents and wider communities have over the housing.
Thank you, Assemblymember Garbutt. I mean, you asked why should we support it over and above, others. I don't think it's about over and above. I think it's as well as. We need to be delivering more houses of all types, and that means supporting all parts of the various different parts of the housing sector to deliver and to succeed, and that's what we're doing with community-led housing. I mean, on Saturday I was at the celebration for the completion and the occupation now of 36 new community-led homes at Churchgrove in Lewisham, which were delivered by Russ and supported with funding from the Mayor's Community Housing Fund. And Lev was there too, actually. It was such a wonderful afternoon, and you got a real sense of the pride of this community that had come together to deliver these homes. And there was the added, and it's not just homes, of course, it is the community, it's the place as well. And that is a mixed tenure development. It's got social rent units as well as shared ownership, shared equity, discount market sale. And the added element there was the self-build and the custom build or self-finish that some of the units had, which really allowed residents to have a lot more control over their homes than most people would have. But it took 15 years to deliver 36 homes. And that was with a supportive council, Lewisham Council, that put the land in for free. So that just goes to this point about how challenging it is to deliver, community-led housing, particularly, from as a developer, as opposed to, acquisitions or something like that. So it is very, very challenging. We want to do as much as we can, on our side from the Mayor to support, and we do through the Community Housing Fund, which provides both capital and revenue funding, through the Hub, which provides a lot of advice and support for groups who, as we've heard, come together without that, big development expertise that the larger organisations have. But there are enormous challenges involved in doing that.
I'd echo our colleague's point around diversification, I suppose. I don't think it's necessarily over and above, but it's around diversification of who is producing housing to meet the obviously very acute housing needs. Nevertheless, I do think with community land trusts there is a commitment to affordable housing in perpetuity. In the previous session, Tom Chance spoke in great detail around how they achieve that and how they accomplish that, and that is distinct from other forms of social housing providers at the moment. So I do think that provides a compelling justification. In terms of what can be done, I do think it's really important, particularly when we think about how well community-led housing has worked elsewhere in the country, that we acknowledge that hasn't happened by accident. It's happened where community-led housing has been capitalised with not just capital funds to acquire assets or land, but also with revenue support to fund pre-development costs and specialist support and guidance as needed, but also the willingness and commitment of a public authority. So in Liverpool, for example, there was a land commission which basically reviewed how across the city region how public land could be used for community and public benefit, not exclusively community-led housing, but that features as a kind of predominant part of community wealth building strategy, which led to a particular community-led housing land disposal policy, only available to community-led housing groups who met certain criteria, and basically disposed of land in a way that reflected best consideration as opposed to the pure land receipt or financial gain. In terms of the benefits, in addition to diversification, I often like to think about these as sort of collective and individual. So if we think about a community land trust, there is a collective endeavour to essentially build and enhance participatory planning and place shaping and place making. If we think about the St Clement's scheme, which originated through Citizens UK, if we go back to the very early days of that, there was community organising involving community groups, faith groups, local educational institutions to think about what that offer might look like. Now, it took a very long time for the various barriers we've spoken about, but it reflects that kind of commitment to, I guess, a collective endeavour. But then there's the individual benefits for residents. Now, community land trusts in particular are relatively new to this country. In the last sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been quite a lot of growth. But there's evidence out there on the affordability of homes relative to over 10 years, evidence out there around building of community cohesion, tackling loneliness by living in a sort of community-led housing organisation. So I think there's I do like to think about collective benefits, but also resident benefits as well.
Thank you. Do you have any further questions? No. Thank you very much. I just have one clarification and then a supplementary from Assembly Member Lord Bailey. But I just want to first of all say I'm very excited that we have you here, Paul. It's really good to have somebody who's involved in the financing of any type of scheme and some of the work that we do, so we can talk about policy, but also the practical perspectives. And so really value you being here.
Well, we have with the Rus scheme that Tom just mentioned.
Yes, no, exactly. So that's what I wanted to kind of, not about that specifically, but that as an example. So for Triodos, when you're looking at a CLT scheme or a cooperative scheme as a business proposition, we've heard the length of time that took over and above a quote-unquote normal development, which, although it could be shorter than 5 years, is normally about 5 years. Is that a factor in financing? So what are the issues that CLTs and co-ops face that you would, because you're able to compare and contrast the two?
Yeah, I mean, some projects are more straightforward than others. Rus was perhaps had complexities to it, and they had to change it kind of part-way through. So perhaps 15 years is in the extreme, but you get all sorts of shades of grey, really, depending on the complexity of the site and the level of support that the group is getting. And as I said before, every group is very different. You can follow a set of rules and protocols, and you can follow a checklist. But the sort of energy and resilience of that group, because you are going to get knockbacks, you are going to get things that go wrong, you are going to have a fair amount of robust challenge as well. So from our point of view as a lender, and I think this applies to anybody financing a scheme like this, because there's different ways to do it, you are, before you're even looking at the concept of the scheme, you're looking at that team and saying, this is going to be a difficult journey, are they capable of delivering? Of course, you never really know, but you kind of test that and you see what support that they've got. And some groups are very closed, they have a very fixed idea of what they want to deliver, and it's that or nothing. Others are more flexible, so it's good to have that flexibility and the ability to deal with the potential additional costs that come along, which can come along for all sorts of reasons, of course. And so those sort of contingencies in the planning and the funding, there is an optimism bias because it's a very positive project. Everyone wants to see it succeed. It's very exciting. It gets a lot of energy and traction. But it's just kind of removing that for a minute and saying, actually, let's just get this down to brass tacks. Let's get down into absolute methodical approach to it, because in essence, it's like any other housing or development project that's done commercially or whether it's done cooperatively, it's still subject to all the same risks. And often it's the community groups that can bash through those and get through them with that sort of positive energy. So whereas we'll look at all the technical and banking risks, we'll also be looking at the people risks and the sort of mindset and willingness to engage professionals and other support in delivering the project. And as I say, having that sort of flexibility to adapt, because quite often you're not on Plan A, you're on Plan T, because it's changed all the way through.
Assemblymember Lord Bailey, one supplementary, and then Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Very quick question. Levent, you talked about acquisitions. I want to quickly ask Tom and Paul, 2 questions. Paul, would it be easier to finance a CLT that was just making an acquisition as opposed to developing it from ground up? And Tom, would it be easier for the Mayor to support CLTs that are just making acquisitions? Is that a model? Is that something they could employ as a tactic to be easier to deliver?
Yeah, the acquisition is in theory easier. It would depend on how fit for purpose it was for that group, because sometimes there's compromises in doing that. If you're developing your own site, you can design it as you want with the community in mind, and with that, like Russ is a good example. They all got together and said, how can we make sure that we're not just walking past each other's front doors, and that there is that interaction. Some community land trusts, of course, are kind of not necessarily in a communal block. They're spread around, again, so you've got more of an estate feel if it's a big one. So that those sort of distinctions are important. And sorry, I've forgotten
the acquisition piece.
The acquisition, that's right, yeah. So that is definitely lower risk, but we're looking at the potential for refurbishment of that property, the sort of EPC net zero, the environmental. So you could find a relatively cheap property that is good for your group, but if it's got a poor sort of energy rating, or it needs a lot of work doing on it, how's that going to be financed? Where's that money coming from? Who's going to do it? Who's going to manage that project? Because it's very rare to find something off the shelf that you can just buy and say, right, we're all in and it's all sorted.
Okay.
But that's clearly lower risk than a development, which is a completely different beast altogether. But you may end up with something more suitable at the end of that. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, other way around. Tom.
So I would really like us to be able to fund more acquisitions for community-led housing. The challenge we have with the Community Housing Fund is that the government placed additionality requirements on it, which mean that we're very limited in terms of what we can fund in acquisitions. So we funded Tonic to acquire 19 shared ownership homes, but that's on the basis, I think, that they were unsold, unsaleable. But then by creating this kind of, I guess, unique market as an LGBTQ retirement community, they were able to create a market in which those shared ownership homes could be sold. But we can't just fund acquisitions of market homes. It would be, I think, good for us to be able to do that, because I think there is a demand out there from private renters, for example, to come together in kind of, co-op or community type arrangements. So I would welcome flexibility to enable us to be able to do that. The other thing I think it would be good for community-led organisations to explore is Section 106. We have a very, we have great difficulties at the moment with the Section 106 market, with large RPs not wanting to bid. I think the challenge for community-led organisations is most of them aren't RPs, so they would have to register, or they would have to purchase, units that were not rented units. But I think it's something that it would be good for the community-led sector to explore further.
Okay, maybe asking for that flexibility around is add to your list when you speak to the government. It's another recommendation for you, Chair.
Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
I was just going to say, I wonder whether there's flexibility in loans instead of grants. That's the only thing I was going to say. Yeah.
Are you next? Oh, apologies. I think Assemblymember Boff was next, and then you.
Okay. You were going to ask your set question. Yeah. This is a
follow-up to the last one.
Yeah. Oh, it was a follow-up?
No, mine's not.
Oh, right. Sorry, I beg your pardon. In answer to Assemblymember Garbutt's panel declared its support for community-led housing. I just wondered, and community-led housing isn't that one thing. There's a whole load of things that have got to be in place for it to happen. But one of those is the land. And I just wondered, what example is the GLA showing the boroughs in site allocations for community-led housing?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So the first one that comes to mind, the main one that comes to mind, is the community-led homes, the 50 community-led homes at St Anne's, which of course was a GLA site that we purchased using a land fund off the NHS. And is now being built up by Peabody and Hill with a community land trust being a requirement.
So that was GLA land being allocated to that?
Yes.
What about the...
We also, sorry, in terms of our funding, have been allocating funding through our Small Site, Small Builders programme to projects related to...
I'm thinking specifically about site
Yeah.
allocations, because you're going to get other questions about that. So, and to what extent... in the pipeline, what are the schemes what are the site allocations that you have for community-led housing?
The St Anne's one is the only community-led housing one that comes to mind on the GLA land at the moment.
I mean, the GLA family owns a lot of land, but I'm not aware of initiatives for community-led housing on Old Oak Common, Barking Riverside, or any of TfL assets. Why is that?
I think it's probably because of the very great challenges around community-led housing, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. I think actually there's a model there, and I think the St Anne's model will show this, where, given that the development risk in this case is not being taken by the community-led organisation, it's being taken by, a large organisation that can bear that development risk much more easily than a small organisation, then hand the units over to a community-led organisation. I think it's probably something we should explore further, both on GLA-owned sites and through Places for London as well.
You say explore that further. It sounds to me from that previous reply that you're waiting for the schemes to come along. Wouldn't it be easier if you said a percentage of site allocations should be earmarked for community-led housing?
Well, I think it depends on the particular site. I don't think we can have necessarily a blanket approach. I would say the St Anne's example is going to be I think it's going to be the biggest community land trust in London. Certainly, it's the biggest I can think of at 50 or 55 units.
We're pretty slow on this, Sir Clements was the first under the previous mayor, and this mayor's sort of continued that. But it doesn't seem there's no game changers here, are there? But you're saying you can't take a blanket approach. Why not?
Well, I don't think we're doing innovative things on different sites anyway. So, for example, on some sites we're looking at incorporating key worker housing. I think we look at, and we could look at that from a community perspective, of course.
I get that. There's all sorts of other things, but in terms of community-led housing, it appears to be absent from site allocations, absent from any kind of. There's no target for them.
Well, it's not absent on the basis that we've done it on one of the mayor's biggest schemes, which is...
So what I'm looking for, and I'm sorry, it's taken a little while, I'm just, like with other targets that the mayor has, why isn't there one for community-led housing in terms of site allocations? I'm not talking about assistance in advance. I recognise that's been done, capital funding to a degree, but in terms of site allocations.
I think it would be challenging to do it without more certainty over funding specifically for community-led housing, because of course we need organisations to be able to buy those units, and we have to be able to support those organisations to be able to do that. So I'm not saying it's not something.
Surely aren't coming forward.
I'm not saying it's not something that we could ever do, but I'm saying that I don't think a blanket approach is necessarily the right one. I think we should be looking on a site-by-site basis.
The most I'm going to get from you is that it's not something you're not saying you won't ever do.
I'm not ruling it out.
You're not
I'm
ruling
just
it
saying
out.
I think I'd have to consider what the implications would be in terms of having a blanket approach.
I will finish now. The implications would be suddenly community groups would realise that there is an allocation of land available. And at the moment, they haven't got that. Thank you, Chair.
I was going to just actually ask you if other Well, but just perhaps redirect and see if the other panellists, I know they have specialisms and views around.
This was specifically about GLA site allocation, and
Okay,
unless there's somebody
if there
else
isn't
from
anybody,
GLA then.
oh, because I thought yes, Levent, if you want to, and then we'll go to.
I might just say, I think one of the things that's maybe tricky is that there's a preconception that a community group needs to already exist when you're allocating a site. So a lot of boroughs who allocate sites will ask the question, where's the demand for this? Do we know that there is going to be a group? And usually there's maybe one group that has spontaneously formed and has been campaigning for years. But I think we could be thinking about it differently, because I think once those opportunities are created, I mean, we saw it a little bit in Tower Hamlets, you know, you get 14 different groups spring up around one site, because if it feels more like an open door, I think there is a latent demand there. And I think also if we were thinking about, I mean, whether or not it's a blanket approach, even with large sites, taking a block and saying, okay, we don't need the group to be pre-formed, but maybe they get formed around the development, and that would be another way of thinking about it, I think.
Thank you. Assemblymember Small-Edwards, finally.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates back to financing, and in particular, which financial models for CLTs and housing cooperatives have or are most successful at both delivering and maintaining affordable homes for local communities? I think we'll start with Paul and then maybe go to Levent and Dr. Tom.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have experience of all financial models, so it's not so much the model itself. Once the thing is existent, it's how it's managed and governed, and how you let members join and leave, and how you manage those protocols, and how you value the property as well. And some organisations have rules and regulations for doing that, saying what you can do and what you can't do. And the ones that are governed really carefully are done so that you don't kind of you don't get stress and strain put on the organisation when people change. There also needs to be proper governance as to who you are letting in as well, because you could get a skew the wrong way in terms of the mix if you want families, and if you're set up as a community organisation for families and you end up with non-families there, obviously that's kind of skewing the original intention. So it's the sort of objectives and intention of it when it's set up. But really, once the things are working, the models that are working, it's kind of just making sure that the level of repairs and maintenance, the debt, any debt that has to be serviced, any other financial obligations are sufficiently covered by people's individual incomes, and how the group deals with the inevitabilities of redundancy or struggling with financial hardship, and how all those are done. And again, it's like I was saying before, really, if you can plan for that at the start and know what you're going to do and how you're going to handle situations like that, it's a lot easier to deal with them when they come along. If it kind of comes out the blue because you set it up in a hurry on a sort of wave of optimism, and then a few years down the line, a few people have left, people haven't got on with each other, there's a roof blown off, not being repaired. It's that, really. So the governance ongoing and the sort of financial model that allowed for those mishaps and ongoing repairs and maintenance. So like I was saying before, it is like a little mini business. You've got what is effectively a commercial enterprise, and it has to have that sort of professional management over the top of it to make sure that it's going to be there in 20, 30 years' time and beyond.
You asked about financial models, and I'm taking that to mean sort of business plans and approaches. I think organisations that focus primarily on development and then sale at low-cost ownership sale, the only way they can become sustainable is to build up surpluses from previous development projects. And when development projects go off-plan and take a lot longer, those surpluses are eaten into. So that's really difficult to make work. Organisations that own assets and borrow for that, as they pay down the debt, they then have an asset and a rental income stream that kind of potentially puts them in a stronger position to grow. And I think we've seen that with housing associations. They've leveraged that quite a lot. I think some of the existing established housing cooperatives have that potential. Many of them were established sort of 30, 40 years ago. paid down the majority of their debt and are probably in a place where they have some reserves to do development. But I think it's the nature of those small organisations who are predominantly led by residents. Their job isn't to become developers and grow. So one of the things we're looking at is having some sort of secondary body that can maintain and hold assets at scale, because it's another thing that kind of helps lenders. I think lenders, the more mainstream lenders, don't want to lend small bits to small organisations. So if we can pool some of the ownership of those assets and make use of that and basically help newer community groups starting up benefit from the success of more established organisations, I think that would be useful. And I think it sort of separates out the kinds of things that have been mentioned, where I think community organisations, groups of residents are very good at looking after their own homes, and that control over that lived experience is what most of them value most. And having perhaps a slightly more professional entity working at a larger scale, dealing with questions of finance and refinancing in order to allow growth and acquisition, would kind of put those different questions probably where they sit better, I would say.
I'd echo some of the comments that Lev has just made, but I think the other thing I would... Sorry, Tom. Okay. But I think just the point I would try and emphasise as well is that over the last, say, decade or so, there's a real inconsistency in funding available to community-led housing groups. And therefore, if we ask what the business model is, my personal view is there isn't one business model, there isn't a replicable business model. Every group sort of has to piece together their business model and their funding in very different ways, because we had, for example, the National Community Housing Fund, which was a real game changer, but that was kind of paused, reopened, paused again and closed. And then there's the varying kind of barriers that we've already talked about in terms of accessing loan finance. So I think really it's testament to the kind of tenacity of lots of the community-led housing groups that many of them have got so far. But I think streamlining and having a very consistent kind of funding model and framework, which doesn't necessarily mean just giving out grants, by the way. I think that is an important part. It can be. But there's also at smaller scales within some local authorities, like revolving loan funds, for example, where groups can pay back into the fund once they've completed and sold homes, if they're doing homes for sale, for example.
Tom?
Have you finished your question? Sorry.
Yeah, largely. My next question is focused on it, but yeah, you can...
No, I was just going to add, sorry, I was just returning to Assembly Member Boff's question for a moment, because I neglected to mention, you asked about GLA sites, I neglected to mention, of course, that Places for London have a CLT at Cable Street, working with them on one of their sites. And I must mention that because I've been spending quite a lot of time with London CLT on that recently. So that's, I think, another example of where land under the Mayor's purview is being used for community-led housing.
Just, Dr. Tom, you kind of touched on it there, but to what extent is private finance available for the development of CLTs and housing cooperatives? And how can community groups be best equipped to access that? And maybe Paul, if you want to come in on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul may be better placed to comment, but in my experience and engagement with groups, I think it's quite rare that they would access private finance, partly due to interest rates and servicing their loans. I think we've touched upon it a little bit, but I think it's not quite the same thing. But I think capitalising or tuning into the debate around Section 106 contributions could be a really fruitful avenue. And if we're talking about practical actions and things that could be embedded into plans and policies, there are community-led housing groups around the country that have benefited either from being part of a scheme, delivering the Section 106 element, housing element, affordable housing element of a scheme, but also where they've benefited from commuted sums that developers have paid in lieu of providing housing on site, and then that's been put into diverted to a community-led housing scheme. So I think there's innovative things you could do.
Yeah, you don't see too much private finance. I mean, we see models where sometimes groups make capital contributions, and you kind of have a little balance sheet really, and you've got capital in there, and they're using that capital to get the scheme going. Maybe they need it to buy the land, and again, if you're a more wealthy group of individuals, you may be able to afford to do that. Most people obviously can't afford to do that really, so we don't often see sort of private finance in there in any sort of way. It would normally be grant finance or specialist providers who are in, maybe for a shorter term. Yeah, I mean, if you've got more cash at the start, you're obviously in a much better position. And I suppose it is important to acknowledge that you do get all sorts of shades of grey in this. We can kind of focus on the sites and the organisations that are doing a lot of things with a high volume of units, and then there's quite small ones really that are just set up for one single scheme and that's it, and they're done. And it doesn't mean it's not good, but they may just have a slightly different route to finance and a different way of approaching it, and may need more or less support depending on how they're doing that really. So it's quite difficult to kind of write a rule book for this, because every scheme is so different and every group is so different. So you never quite know which way it's going to go, really. And so from our point of view as a lender, it's quite difficult to say. If people say, well, what do we need to do? We say, well, we can't tell you what to do. Do what you think you want to do. That's the most important thing. Don't do it to fit what we're saying. Do it for what you want. Then try and make it work, get the advice, and then present it to us, and we'll look at it critically from a financial point of view.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you. Almost to continue this theme, really, what incentives are there for housing associations, private developers to partner with community groups to deliver community housing? Do you think there's any benefits to this partnership approach to developing this form of housing? If I start Levent, and then everybody else can jump in.
So I think partnership can mean quite a lot of different things. We have been involved in a number of partnership projects. It has tended to be that a group has preformed and has a lot of ideas about what they want, and they want to find a partner that will deliver what they want. So a lot of the time we are trying to work with them to say, okay, what have you got to offer the partner? Because a partnership will be a two-way thing, and sometimes that can be quite hard. If a group is very fixed and it must have all of these things, they probably won't find a partner, and a partner won't want to partner with them because they're just too demanding. We have the other experience of partnerships in London, I think, even where groups are flexible and the motivations for it's typically a housing association will probably be reputational. They want to be involved in something. They like the values of the group. Maybe it reminds them of how they set up in the 60s and what they were trying to start off as. And some of them have a kind of specialist niche, and they kind of see that in a community-led housing organisation. So they kind of get that element of it. But in terms of the day-to-day practice, it sort of feels a little bit at odds with how they normally work. So that makes partnership a little bit more challenging. And I think, we said at the beginning, when times are hard, a lot of larger organisations, the community-led housing thing is like number 10 on their list of priorities. It's a nice to have. And we've also seen a number of partnerships, both with kind of council development with, say, a tenant management organisation or a housing association with a kind of co-housing group or a co-op, get sort of either kicked into the long grass or just abandoned completely. So I think that's challenging. I think some of the learnings we've had in the future is, rather than start with preconceived groups of what they want, if we could approach it from the perspective of what does a housing association or a developer want, and are there things that could be offered to them. So it might be savings in how the thing is managed. For a developer, there might be support through the planning process, or things around custom build, community infrastructure levy exemptions, and build the group of people around the scheme that the partner already wants to do, or kind of works in terms of viability or works in terms of unit size mix. I think we might have a bit more traction along that route of partnership. So finding almost starting with the project first and building the group around it rather than a group with a list of demands.
Tom?
So there are some examples of partnerships. So there's a small housing association called J49, which has partnered with the Deptford Ragged Trust on their community housing project. And I think in quite a few of these cases, it'll be in order, because a lot of these community-led organisations aren't registered providers, they will partner with a housing association to manage the social rented units. So CDS cooperatives, for example, will also do this. There have been some less successful examples. So there was a large housing association that was partnering with a small community-led organisation where it fell through, I think because the small organisation wanted the large housing association essentially to guarantee them a fixed price on the build, which the housing association just couldn't do. They weren't able to wear that sort of financially. So there are difficulties and there are challenges. I think there are opportunities, though. So like I was sort of saying earlier, I think given where the Section 106 market is at the moment, if we can generate more interest from community-led organisations to perhaps look at taking on some Section 106 units, we might have to look at the tenure, given the issues around RP status. It might mean councils having to be more flexible about some of the tenures on the Section 106 units, but that might be the alternative to losing them altogether because there's simply no interest from any other partners in actually purchasing them. So I think there are opportunities out there for more partnership working.
I think you might be correct, but how would that be facilitated? I think that's the problem, isn't it? I think if you could get people in a room with the expertise, with the idea is we could have 100% or nothing, or we can wade through this and get something. But where's the incentive? Why would a ARP bother? You know, who would get them to the table? I think I want to add that to your list of things to do, Tom, to try and sort of broker that. Do you think that's possible?
We are looking quite actively about what we can do in terms of Section 106, and we're convening organisations in the sector together to try and see if we can get some movement there. So yes, there is a convening role for the GLA on this particular issue.
Yeah, I suppose any partner community would really have to understand your challenges to be part of that conversation.
I'm also trying to, as well, this is sparked by Chair of the London Housing Panel, Dinah Roke, trying to look at some of the barriers with the regulators, some of the barriers to small organisations becoming RPs in the first place, because there are a number that have sort of approached me and said, the hurdles they have to cross to become RP, to get RP status, are enormous, and it's very, very difficult for small organisations to become RPs.
See, Chair, that sounds like another recommendation. Let me ask quite a direct question in a way, Deputy Mayor. Should the Mayor continue to support community-led housing if it's not addressing the most acute housing need by providing the maximum amount of housing for social rent? Because the Mayor has priorities. You have issues here, Tom. Should you be doing this, or should you just concentrate on the heavy lifting?
Well, social rent is very, very important, obviously. It's the housing type that we need the most. But look, key worker housing is also incredibly important as well. We are finding that people on moderate incomes that we need to keep the city moving are having to leave or move far out in the city away from where they work. So, and I think that community-led housing can play a particular role in providing that kind of intermediate housing. So I think we should support community-led housing. I'm interested in how, if we can support some different models as well, rather than just supporting direct development, although we will continue to do that. The sort of model that Lev was talking about with more acquisitions and things like that, if we can get the funding to work for that, then yes, I think we should be looking at other models to support community-led housing too.
Okay. Again, this is to anybody on the panel who feels like they can contribute, but don't feel the need to have to accept the Deputy Mayor. Expect a contribution from you. Is funding through the Community Housing Fund or through the Affordable Homes Programme a viable option for most community groups in London? Levent, you seem primed.
I can take it. So I think So I was just going to say something about your earlier point.
Please do.
Is this worth commenting? And I'll move on to that, which is it's worth getting it in context. So the Community Housing Fund is, 30 million capital compared to an affordable housing programme of about 4 billion, is it? So that's less than 0.1%. And it's not a surprise that we see the output annually we're estimating is about 0.1% of everything that's built in London. The total stock owned by community-led housing organisations is also about 0.1% of all dwellings across London. I think, so even if we're talking about scaling up, we'd have to go 10 times more to get to 1%, which is kind of crazy to think. But even if we could get double it, it would still be tiny. I think the opportunity within the accessing the affordable housing programme, in theory, the affordable housing programme is, I think the GLA has been a lot more flexible than, say, Homes England has in terms of their affordable housing programme about what kinds of tenures it can be used for. But it is primarily a capital fund, and it's only really available at start on site. So there's a load of work that needs to happen before that in terms of securing sites, getting planning, even doing some of the kind of pre-tender work and getting contractors on board. So I think one of the things that the Community Housing Fund has done, which is probably the unique thing and probably unique for the housing and land bit of the GLA, is having a revenue element which kind of allows groups to get to that stage. So how will you ever access capital if you haven't got planning permission for it? Okay, you might be able to get a partner to cash flow some of it, and that has been explored, and part of the reason why some have tried to partner with existing organisations. But it goes back to that point of control. So I think those smaller bits of revenue are quite important, and perhaps I would say if we're looking at the affordable housing programme, it's less about numbers of units in terms of community-led housing, but more about the kind of innovation and social value that it's delivering. So too hard a focus on numbers and value for money will, I think, mean it's comparing it to the likes of L&Q or Notting Hill, it's never going to kind of compete favourably with some of those. But I think if we're talking about a small amount of something that kind of pushes innovation, either spatially, in terms of organisation, who's housed, why they're housed, what kind of housing they need or aspire to, I think it can, I think there's scope there for using the affordable housing programme.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey, there's a comment from Natalie online.
Please go ahead, Natalie. Thank you. Can you hear me, Natalie? Natalie? Are we on mute or is she on mute?
She did warn us there's a lag, so it's possible she just hasn't heard you yet.
Can you hear me, Natalie? Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm doing some tech management because of the way that I'm accessing this, so apologies. Hopefully you can all hear me. And apologies if there's a lag. Lord Bailey, I was just going to address the point on AHP. I get peaked up whenever anyone says AHP for obvious reasons. So the AHP is open to bids and open to the concept and conceit of community-led housing, and we are in... for commercial confidentiality reasons, I won't go into detail of exactly where we are, but we are in advanced negotiations and potential approval stages for community-led schemes through that route. I think the point that colleagues on the panel make is really appropriate, and I'm aware, Sean, in a different conversation, we were having a conversation about revenue support, and I think there is a recognition that I certainly have that whilst the AHP is there as our major capital lever to seek to get new supply in London, and we have a housing strategy that promotes the idea of diversity in housing because it's really important for different people to access housing in different ways and through different tenures. The fact that we do not have revenue as part of the AHP is a limiting factor to some of that, and it's something that we have historically engaged with central government on, because not only does that affect community-led housing, Assemblymember Cooper raised a point earlier about how this interacts with specialist housing, and obviously for specialist housing, revenue is extremely important in moving those things forward. So one can imagine that to get to kind of the apex of this, where one's using community-led housing to support people with specialist needs through an AHP or any other route, complementary revenue funding would be really important. So I think from my position as the SRO for that programme and interacting with and leading the community-led housing fund, I think getting to a point where there's recognition of the importance of that revenue funding to build these organisations, projects, processes into programmes could be really beneficial to the sector growing in scale, as some of my panel members have described.
Thank you for that, and Chair, back to you.
Thank you, and we'll go straight to Assemblymember Garbett, please.
Thanks everyone for your contributions. I'm really interested in how Londoners find out about these opportunities and the potential for CLTs and housing co-ops. Do you think there'd be benefit in the community sector for the mayor to raise more public awareness? And kind of related to this, do you think there's a job to be done to map land ownership in all parts of London, like the Southwark Land Commission are currently doing? I'm not sure who would like to start. Who hasn't spoken for a while? Who's keen to speak? Levent, you look like you've got something to contribute.
I don't know how to speak, but I mean, part of when the Community Housing London Hub was set up, a big part of what we were initially intended to do, I think, was sort of promotional role, and we used to do a lot more events, but gradually it's become harder to sort of stand up in front of an audience and say, hey, you should all do this because it's going to be 15 years of hard work. There's a large chance that it won't go anywhere and you won't succeed. And you start to think, I can't honestly tell people they should do this. So I think unless we can make the opportunities easier, and we still get inquiries from people, and they tend to be from people who say, I've seen this scheme, how can I move in? Or can I get, some sort of can I get to live in community-led housing? Very few people are saying, how can I build some of them are saying, how can I build it? Because they've seen it in the press. But once they understand how challenging that is, I think that it goes back to this point of like spontaneously promoting something for groups to campaign. And it does happen, but it's hard. I can't remember the second part of your question, which is about
mapping of land, and availability and awareness of land, but it kind of
I think the two are connected, because it kind of goes to opportunity. So there's no point mapping the ownership of land, and we've actually got access. There are now tools that say who the owner is of pretty much all registered land. The question is more whether that land is either available and not in use. So if it's owned by a council or a public body, are they planning to use it for something else? Or do they have plans to build their own housing on it? And then secondly, if it's more privately owned, or even with most housing associations, if you were trying to buy land or take ownership of it, not enter into a partnership, they will expect close to market value. You will need to pay for that pretty upfront, and if you haven't got the capital in the first place, I think most community-led housing organisations really struggle to play in the private market because of timing. It'll take longer. Even if they can pull the money together, it'll take longer. And related to an earlier point about private financing, I mean, if you're talking about bank lending, that is a form of private financing, I suppose, but it tends to be, I think nowadays it's about 70% loan to value. So if that 30% is the big missing element. So that equity element, which, if you were buying a house might be the deposit, it's one way to think about it, can be fundraised from the community, but that's hard work and it depends on who you've got backing the scheme. So typically it has been a mixture of grants, a mixture of subsidised land, kind of filling that equity space. So I think, yes, mapping land is one thing, but it needs to be a bit more than that, and you need to kind of know what land is suitable and realistic to access.
Yeah, I'd like to just answer the question about awareness. And I think that there is a real need to raise more awareness of community-led housing, particularly to groups and communities that are maybe marginalised or experiencing particular forms of housing disadvantage. One of the key findings from the research project I mentioned, which is about community-led housing and its take-up by black and minority ethnic communities, one of the crucial findings we found is that the communities who have really pursued community-led housing in recent years have done so either through specialist support through organisations like the Hub, or the hubs that exist in many cities, or simply through word of mouth. And actually we spoke to many people in quite prominent national organisations that advocate for example, race equity in housing, who were completely oblivious to the existence of community-led housing as an option to tackle the injustices and disadvantages that they advocate for tackling. So I do really feel like that should be a really strong point and a really strong recommendation. That is, I think if we are interested in using community-led housing to diversify housing production, I really think that sort of awareness raising is a really crucial element of it, channeled not only through the kind of infrastructure bodies that already exist, but themselves are often undercapitalised actually in the community-led housing sector, but also through this broader networks and alliances that advocate for tackling housing injustice.
Thank you.
Thanks. Back to you, yeah.
Thanks very much. It would be really great if you could share that research with the Secretariat for us to circulate and take a look at. So before I go on to this next question, in the planning committee we had Barrett come, Sarita. Yeah. Yes. And one of the issues that came up was the struggle around Section 106 at the moment because of cost and so on, and them struggling to find RPs that would take on that Section 106. And she gave an example of 58 units, I think. I've only got this exact number in my head because I signed off the minutes the other day, but 58 units, I think, in Southwark that no RP wanted, and so these were specifically built out as for social rent. And I just wondered if there is, perhaps not for answer now, but the question that was raised in the first panel in this committee today about the ease with which or not that people find becoming an RP, if there is something about bridging a gap, because that was really also very evident at Ross when we went to visit, that they were struggling with having to figure out workarounds because the administrative burden was quite high, but it was something that had to be done in order for them to benefit from the CLT structure that they had. And I just wonder if that is something that you might want to comment on, Tom, and Levent as well, and actually, well, all of you. But I think it feels like there is a bridge to be built across those two problems, and everybody could be resolving each other's problems.
Yes, as I said earlier, it's been raised with me by the chair of the London Housing Panel, and so I am going to be convening a group to come together to discuss, hopefully with the regulator, the barriers to small organisations becoming RPs. So we're very conscious of that, and also, very keen to promote a diversity of organisations that can take on Section 106 units, because the large RPs at the moment, for various reasons, are not particularly interested in doing so.
I think there's the RP requirement is in legislation, so it's quite hard to change. But if we read it really carefully, we probably find that it affects only sub-market rented and where it's GLA capital funded. So one place for and also it does so, and for low cost ownership GLA capital funding, GLA has discretion about whether it gives capital funding to a non-RP. So if you could change the legislation, I would suggest it's just a small tweak to say GLA has discretion of whether it wants to give capital grant to non-RPs for low-cost rental. On the other side, I think the Section 106 requirements probably expect those homes to go to an RP, but that's a planning thing. So it could be a slight tweak of a Section 106 to say, actually, we will permit a non-RP to take these on, or we'll look at changing the tenure to perhaps something more like low-cost ownership. I don't know what is more appropriate.
So can I just interrupt you? So basically, they could just fix that quite relatively quickly locally. It doesn't have to be a big thing?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not 100% expert on all of this, but I think that is in planning. So it depends on whether you need capital grant in order to be able to purchase them, which then probably connects to another area is I don't know what these developers are selling those Section 106 units for or at, but you know, some of the experience we've had, I think Gida Housing Cooperative alluded to it, the expectation and the sale price needs to match the social housing value of those homes, so that might be a mismatch.
I mean, I know how much Barrett sell a social unit for, but I can understand the problem. But thank you for that. So we're in the home straights, you'll be pleased to know. I have a few more questions. I'm sorry, I forgot. Natalie, before we move on, apologies. Natalie, are you able to?
I don't apologise at all, thank you. Yes, so just I put my hand up and down because Tom said most of it, and then there was an expansion that meant I just felt compelled to clarify. I think it's a really helpful point that Cyrita is raising, and I think Cyrita is, along with various other colleagues in that part of the sector, seeking to work through the Section 106 issue generally, which, as Tom has rightly said, we are also seeking to see what the appropriate interventions and brokerage requirements are. I think it's appropriate to explore how one gets to a point where small to medium organisations have got simple routes to accessing financing, planning and acquisition at a variety of tenures. I think that is an appropriate exploration of potential outcome. And as has just been outlined by the other panellists, there's a few different moments in the system where there could be changes that are explored to help get to that outcome. I think one of the existential questions for the sector and for the regulator is about what they are doing for the sector and what they are not doing for the sector, because I think if the regulator was here, they might highlight that the fact that the sector is regulated allows it to get finance, allows it to be seen as a kind of asset class which can leverage investment in its own way. And so it might be that in the kind of long term, to get to a point where different parts of the sector can do what they need to maximise the supply for a diversity of clients, there might need to be different options or different policies or different structures or a different meaning of regulation. So I think it's absolutely the right area to explore. And I think that's why we will do that convening as Tom has outlined. But it is one that is written in detail that I think needs to be got into so the appropriate tweaks can be made.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I have a few quick questions. Much of this has been covered, so I won't repeat. To Tom and Natalie, could you please provide the committee, if you have this data, on the percentage of community groups that access support through the community-led housing hub, and for Levent as well, sorry, and how many of those are successful in developing out schemes? I don't know if at this point you wanted to talk about that, but if it might be helpful just to have the data for us to look at.
I mean, we can probably best to provide it to you post committee, but the data I have here is the hub has supported 57 CLH organisations with work on 61 projects and has provided support and advice to 10 boroughs. Does that align with your figures?
Yeah, that's about right.
We can provide them to you after the meeting.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. And also to you, Tom and Natalie, are there plans in place for the community-led housing hub to continue to be funded after 2026?
I think that the way the hub is being funded is going to change. It certainly has a funding stream from our small sites, small builders programme for a specific piece of work. I might pass over to Lev, though, for sort of more detailed comment on that.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any plans to continue to fund the hub. It's meant we're already trying to be part funded by doing a bit more consultancy type approaches. Usually that is to organisations who can pay, so it's not to community-led housing groups. It's usually boroughs who are looking to release sites. It might be for housing associations. I think we are trying to develop models, again, that make it slightly more streamlined, and it does mean the nature of what we were kind of conceived of doing will change probably quite dramatically. So we will still talk to anyone, but it means the kind of ongoing hand-holding mentoring will be difficult to support. But equally, if there isn't any funding for, any revenue funding for groups to do feasibilities, go through the process and get planning permissions, then you sort of think, well, that's probably not where they need the hand-holding. And if we're maybe trying to focus more on developers to do that stage of the work, or housing association to do that kind of work, the role changes slightly, and it's a bit more about facilitating and convening groups around projects, and I think that is potentially something that those bigger players could fund. The question goes back to why would they? And although there might be some benefits for them, I think it's a sort of one of those things where they're probably a little bit risk averse, so they want to see it happen a bit more. So it might benefit from a little bit more policy persuasion from the GLA, etc. So that whether that's some conditions on funding, as we've seen at the St Anne's site, or planning-related percentage policies or something like that, I think those will help.
Thank you. And then my final question. So I'm sure Tom and Natalie, you will be contacting the planning committee with any changes you may want to see in the updated London plan. But I wanted to ask you, Tom, what from the academic perspective and your research perspective, what you think would work well in hypothetically in an updated London plan to enable this sort of development across London?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, there's a cocktail of different things to be done, as we've talked about over the last couple of hours. But I think in terms of plan and a planning perspective, I think it goes back to the points made by Assemblymember Boff around kind of site allocations and things like that. I think Tom Chance answered the same question in a similar way in his session. But I think allocations of land and really providing a very clear avenue for community groups to mobilise around a particular site could be something that would be a valuable proposition.
Thank you very much. That concludes the second panel. And again, thank you for your contributions today. You're welcome to stay, or you can leave if you want to. We just have a few bits to do to wrap up this session. So can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Can we note the work programme and the additional activity undertaken since the last meeting, namely the informal meeting with key stakeholders on 4th of June 2024 and the site visit on 26th of June 2024? The date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for 18th of September at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business and declare this meeting closed.